During the darkest days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when millions of American families were struggling to feed their children, a group of criminals saw opportunity. Schools were closed. Kids weren't getting meals. The federal government rushed emergency funding to non-profits that could step in and provide food to vulnerable children who depended on school breakfast and lunch programs. In Minnesota, a non-profit called Feeding Our Future claimed they could help. They said they were serving tens of thousands of meals daily to hungry children across the state. The federal government sent them money. Lots of money. In 2019, before the pandemic, they received about $3.4 million. By 2021, that number exploded to nearly $200 million. Except there was one problem. The meals didn't exist. The children weren't being fed. And the money, at least $250 million, possibly as much as $400 million, was stolen. This is the story of the largest pandemic relief fraud in American history. A scheme so brazen that one restaurant claiming to serve 5,000 children a day had previously averaged maybe 30 customers. So absurd that sites claimed to serve meals to thousands of kids from tiny storefronts with no kitchens. So corrupt that even when state officials tried to stop the fraud, they were threatened with lawsuits and accusations of racism. And here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Most of America has never heard of it. While crypto hacks and celebrity scandals dominate headlines, a $250 million theft from programs meant to feed hungry kids during a pandemic has quietly unfolded with minimal national attention. Today, we're exposing the Feeding Our Future fraud. Who orchestrated it, how they got away with it for so long, why nobody stopped them, and what happened to the money that was supposed to feed America's most vulnerable children. Because this isn't just a fraud story. It's a story about systemic failure, about criminals who exploited a crisis, and about the children who went hungry while con artists bought Porsches and real estate in Kenya. To understand how this fraud worked, you need to understand the Federal Child Nutrition Program. For decades, this USDA program has reimbursed schools, daycares, and community organizations for providing meals to low-income children. It's not perfect, but it's kept millions of American kids from going hungry. When COVID hit in March 2020, schools closed nationwide. Suddenly, children who relied on school meals had nothing. The USDA responded by relaxing program requirements to get food to kids faster. The USDA allowed for-profit restaurants to participate in the program, as well as allowed for off-site food distribution to children outside of educational programs. The goal was noble: remove bureaucratic barriers so non-profits and restaurants could quickly serve meals to kids at home. But those relaxed requirements created massive opportunities for fraud. Enter Amy Bock, a 44-year-old woman who founded Feeding Our Future in 2016. Before the pandemic, her non-profit was small, receiving about $3.4 million annually to operate a handful of meal sites. But Bock had ambitions. And she had something else: a network of co-conspirators ready to exploit the emergency. The charges allege that beginning in early 2020, the organization began recruiting individuals and entities to open fake federal child nutrition program sites throughout Minnesota. These weren't legitimate feeding operations. They were fronts designed to steal federal money. Here's how the scam worked. Bock would recruit someone, often with no experience in food service, to open a meal site. This could be a restaurant, a community center, even a tiny storefront. The recruit would register with Feeding Our Future as their sponsor, giving Bock control over approving their claims and certifying their reimbursements. These sites would then claim to be serving impossible numbers of meals. SED's Safari restaurant reported approximately $600,000 in annual revenue in each of the 3 years prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. By July 2020, Syed claimed to be serving meals to 5,000 children per day, 7 days a week. Think about that. A restaurant that previously served maybe 30 to 50 customers daily and made $600,000 annually was suddenly claiming to serve 5,000 meals per day. That's 35,000 meals per week. over 1.8 million meals per year. From a restaurant, the math didn't add up. The logistics were impossible, but the claims kept coming, and Feeding Our Future kept certifying them. One site claimed to serve 2,000 to 3,000 meals daily from a restaurant that had previously made $500 in sales per day. Another submitted attendance rosters claiming 2,040 children attended their after-school program, but when investigators checked, only 20 of those names matched actual students in the school district. In total, Feeding Our Future opened more than 250 sites throughout Minnesota between March 2020 and January 2022, and falsely claimed to have served 125 million meals. That's 125 million meals in less than 2 years. From a non-profit that had served maybe a few 100,000 meals in its entire existence before the pandemic. And the Minnesota Department of Education was sending them checks every month based on those fraudulent claims. But here's where the story gets truly enraging. State officials knew something was wrong. As early as July 2019, before the pandemic even started, Minnesota Department of Education officials identified early signs of fraud, including meal claims they considered implausible. When the pandemic hit and the numbers exploded, alarm bells were ringing everywhere. State employees documented box concerning behavior. They flagged the implausible meal counts. They questioned how tiny storefronts with no kitchens could be serving thousands of meals daily. But they kept paying. Why? According to the audit, state officials cited fears of lawsuits, accusations of racial discrimination, and negative public scrutiny if funding were denied. Let that sink in. State officials suspected massive fraud. They had evidence of impossible meal counts, but they continued approving payments because they were afraid of being sued or accused of discrimination. Amy Bock had discovered a powerful weapon: the threat of playing the racism card. Many of her recruited site operators were Somali Americans, and Bock allegedly threatened to claim that denying payments was discrimination against the Somali community. State officials, terrified of controversy, backed down, and the fraud continued to scale. While children went hungry, the Feeding Our Future conspirators were living like royalty. The defendants used the proceeds of their fraudulent scheme to purchase luxury vehicles, residential and commercial real estate in Minnesota, as well as property in Ohio and Kentucky, real estate in Kenya and Turkey, and to fund international travel. Let me give you specific examples of what they bought with money meant for hungry kids. The Husseins used $173,438 of their proceeds to pay off the mortgage on their home in Shakopee, Minnesota, and also purchased a 2021 Porsche for $93,250, a 2022 GMC truck for $61,722. Abukar spent millions on real estate, including a 37-acre commercial property in Lakeville, and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase an aircraft in Nairobi, Kenya. An aircraft in Kenya, with money meant to feed American children during a pandemic. Amy Bock herself seized luxury handbags, jewelry, a 2013 Porsche, and millions in cash. Federal agents executing search warrants found stacks of cash, designer bags, photos of Lamborghinis and Mercedes, the trappings of extreme wealth purchased with stolen federal funds. But the conspirators weren't just spending the money. They were operating a sophisticated kickback scheme. The Husseins paid at least $140,000 in kickbacks to Feeding Our Future employee Abdikerm Idle, and at least $12,000 in kickbacks to Amy Bock. In some instances, these kickback payments were disguised as consulting fees. This was organized crime. Site operators would submit fraudulent meal count sheets claiming they'd served thousands of children. Feeding Our Future would approve and certify these false claims. The Minnesota Department of Education would send reimbursement checks. Then the site operators would kick back a percentage to Bock and her co-conspirators. Sometimes the kickbacks were cash, tens of thousands of dollars handed over in parking lots or offices. Sometimes they were disguised as consulting fees paid to shell companies created specifically to launder the money and make it appear legitimate. And the scale kept growing. Feeding Our Future went from receiving and disbursing approximately $3.4 million in federal funds in 2019 to nearly $200 million in 2021. That's almost 60 times more money in just 2 years. Think about the audacity. These criminals looked at a global pandemic, at millions of families struggling to feed their children, at emergency government programs designed to help the most vulnerable, and they saw it as an opportunity to get rich. One woman, Najmo Ahmed, signed a meal count sheet on December 31st, 2020, claiming her tiny grocery store served 3,250 children twice a day during a week in January 2021. That's 6,500 meals per day from a small storefront grocery. Between April 2020 and April 2021, Evergreen Grocery and Deli claimed to have served over 1.4 million meals to children. The lies were so transparent, so obviously impossible, that investigators would later testify they couldn't believe anyone took them seriously. But the checks kept coming. The fraud couldn't last forever. By late 2021, even with state officials looking the other way, the scale had become too massive to ignore. On January 20th, 2022, the FBI conducted coordinated raids across Minnesota. 25 search warrants executed simultaneously at dawn. Agents seized documents, computers, luxury vehicles, and millions in cash. In September 2022, U.S. Attorney Andrew Luger announced federal charges against 47 people connected to Feeding Our Future. It was the largest pandemic relief fraud case ever charged in American history. The indictments revealed a conspiracy so extensive that it shocked even seasoned federal investigators. By November 2025, that number had grown to 78 people charged. 78 individuals involved in stealing from a program meant to feed children. The mastermind, Amy Bock, went to trial in early 2025, along with one of her top co-conspirators, Salim Said, the restaurant owner who claimed to serve 5,000 meals daily. After a 6-week trial, Bock was convicted on 4 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, 1 count of bribery, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit federal programs bribery. The evidence was overwhelming. Investigators showed fake attendance rosters with names copied from phone books, meal count sheets claiming to serve thousands of children from locations that didn't have kitchens, purchase receipts that didn't match the claimed meal quantities. Witnesses testified about the cash kickbacks, the shell companies, the systematic fraud. Prosecutors described Bock as wielding near-total control over the operation. She approved which sites could participate, certified their fraudulent meal claims, and collected kickbacks from grateful conspirators who were getting rich off stolen federal money. Throughout the trial, Bock maintained she was innocent. She claimed she was just trying to help feed children. She even tried to suggest that prosecution was motivated by discrimination against the Somali community. The jury didn't buy it. Guilty on all counts. Said was also convicted on conspiracy to commit wire fraud, 4 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit federal programs bribery, 8 counts of bribery, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and 5 counts of money laundering. As of late 2025, out of 78 people charged, 56 have pleaded guilty. 7 others were convicted at trial. Many more await trial. The convictions keep coming. Sentences have been severe. Mohammed Ismail received 12 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay over $47 million in restitution. 2 scheme leaders, Mukhtar Mohammed Sharif and Abdiaziz Shafi Farah, were sentenced to 17.5 years in prison in January 2025 and 28 years in prison in August 2025, respectively. 28 years in prison for stealing from a program meant to feed hungry children. But here's the gut-wrenching part. Most of the money is gone. Although more than $250 million is alleged to have been stolen, only around $75 million had been recovered as of early 2025. As much of the money was spent on unrecoverable expenses like luxury meals and hotels, or was transferred to overseas investments which the United States cannot seize. $175 million vanished, spent on Porsches that have depreciated, real estate in foreign countries the US can't touch, luxury vacations, designer handbags, international travel, cash given to accomplices who've disappeared. The government can seize Box Porsche and her designer bags. They can drain her bank accounts. But that $5.2 million forfeiture judgment barely makes a dent in the $250 million stolen. And the actual scale might be even worse. In an early January 2026 report, the federal government has estimated that total fraud from the case could top $9 billion, though this figure likely refers to broader Minnesota fraud schemes beyond just feeding our future. The Feeding Our Future scandal isn't just about one nonprofit in Minnesota. It's about systemic failures that allowed it to happen. A 2024 audit by the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor concluded that this wasn't just sophisticated criminals outsmarting the system. The report found that officials raised concerns and flagged irregularities early, particularly during the pandemic, yet continued approving payments. State employees knew. They documented their concerns. They raised alarms. And they were ignored or overruled by superiors who prioritized avoiding controversy over stopping fraud. The audit described the Minnesota Department of Education as ill-prepared to manage the surge of pandemic funding. But it was worse than being unprepared. Officials made active choices to continue payments even after fraud was suspected. Why? Because Amy Bock and her network weaponized accusations of discrimination. When state officials tried to deny payments or increase scrutiny, Bock allegedly threatened to claim racism. In an environment where organizations are terrified of being accused of bias, that threat was incredibly effective, and it worked. State officials backed down, payments continued, and the fraud scaled to unimaginable proportions. This raises uncomfortable questions about how fraud prevention interacts with legitimate concerns about discrimination. Yes, communities of color have historically faced discrimination in accessing government programs. Yes, increased scrutiny of minority-led organizations can be discriminatory. But how do we prevent criminals from exploiting those legitimate concerns to shield their fraud? There's no easy answer. But what happened in Minnesota shows what happens when fear of accusations paralyzes officials who should be stopping obvious fraud. The other systemic failure was the USDA's pandemic rule changes. The relaxed requirements made sense in a crisis. Get food to kids fast, worry about paperwork later. But they also created massive vulnerabilities, allowing for-profit restaurants to participate without proper vetting, permitting off-site meal distribution without attendance verification, accepting self-reported meal counts without independent confirmation. All of these changes were designed to help feed children quickly. All of them were exploited by criminals. And here's what's truly terrifying. This wasn't unique to Minnesota. Similar pandemic relief frauds happened nationwide. The Feeding Our Future case is just the largest. It's the one that got caught. How many others are still operating? Let's talk about the real victims of this fraud, not the taxpayers who lost $250 million, though that matters. Not the government programs that were exploited, though that's important. The real victims are the children. The defendants falsely claimed to have served 91 million meals, for which they fraudulently received nearly $250 million in federal funds. That money did not go to feed kids. Think about what $250 million could have done. At roughly $3 per meal, that's over 80 million actual meals that could have been provided to hungry children during the worst economic crisis in generations. 80 million meals that never happened because criminals stole the money. While Amy Bock drove her Porsche, children went hungry. While Saeed bought real estate, families struggled. While conspirators vacationed internationally on stolen funds, American kids who depended on school meals had nothing. And many of these children were from the very communities the fraudsters claimed to be serving. Minnesota's Somali American community has been portrayed in media coverage of this case But it's important to remember, they're victims too. Legitimate Somali-led community organisations that actually do feed children now face increased scrutiny and suspicion because of what these criminals did. The Feeding Our Future fraud has had a chilling effect on legitimate pandemic relief programs. Other nonprofits now face more bureaucratic hurdles. Verification requirements have been restored and strengthened, which is good for preventing fraud, but means it takes longer to get help to people who need it. And the cynicism this creates is immeasurable. Americans already distrust government programs. Stories like this, $250 million stolen from a program meant to feed hungry kids, reinforce the narrative that government aid is wasteful and rife with fraud. But here's what's important to remember. The Federal Child Nutrition Program has successfully fed millions of children for decades. The vast majority of participants are legitimate. Most nonprofits actually do the work they claim to do. Feeding Our Future was an exception, a massive criminal exception, but an exception nonetheless. The problem wasn't the program. The problem was criminals who exploited a crisis and state officials who failed to stop them even when the fraud was obvious. As I write this in January 2026, trials are still ongoing. More convictions are coming. More money is being seized and forfeited. But most of the stolen $250 million will never be recovered. It's gone, spent, laundered, hidden in overseas accounts beyond the reach of US courts. Amy Bock faces decades in prison. Her co-conspirators are being sentenced one by one. The criminal enterprise has been dismantled, but the damage is done. 78 people charged, 56 guilty pleas, 7 trial convictions, prison sentences ranging from years to decades, hundreds of millions in restitution orders that will likely never be fully paid. And somewhere in Minnesota, children who should have been fed with that money are still hungry. That's the real cost of the Feeding Our Future fraud. Not the numbers on indictments or the dollar figures in forfeiture orders. The cost is measured in empty stomachs, in families who struggled while criminals got rich, in children who went without, while Porsches were purchased and real estate in Kenya was bought. This is the largest pandemic relief fraud in American history. And most people have never heard of it. Now you have. And you'll never look at pandemic relief programs the same way again. The question is, what other frauds are still operating right now, stealing from programs meant to help people in need? How many other Amy Bocks are out there claiming to help while pocketing millions? We may never know. But after Feeding Our Future, we know it's possible. We know the scale it can reach. And we know that when officials are afraid to act, criminals can steal hundreds of millions of dollars meant for the most vulnerable among us. Those 91 million meals that were never served, those weren't just statistics. They were hungry children, real kids who needed help during a pandemic. And they got nothing. $250 million stolen from hungry kids. 78 people charged. Most of America never heard about it. If this story made you angry, hit that like button and subscribe. We're exposing the frauds that don't get the attention they deserve. Comment below, how did this fly under the radar when it's the largest pandemic fraud in history? What scandal should I investigate next? Thanks for watching. And remember, just because something isn't trending doesn't mean it doesn't matter.